Welcome, everyone. My name is Maggie Congwin, and I'm a member of the Kellogg Alumni Relations team. Before we get started in a few moments, we wanted to let you know that all attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. However, we encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time via the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your screen. Our presentation will last about 60 minutes today. Dean Cornelli and Dr. Bernie Banks will have a conversation and address audience questions throughout the discussion. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on Kellogg's YouTube channel at a later date. On behalf of the Kellogg School of Management, thank you for joining us today. With that, I will turn it over to Dean Cornelli to get us started.
Welcome to everybody to our inaugural conversation with a distinguished alumni event. We're really excited to start this series because in the middle of this crisis, it's really important to go to talk to visionary alumni leaders and ask them, right, how they are facing key issues in their community, in their organizations, in the world at large. And I am delighted to kick off this series with an alum who is now also a colleague. And that is Bernie Banks. That has had an amazing career that makes me pale when I read it. And it's a great example when I say, you know, at Kellogg, we have amazing, eclectic faculty who bring different point of view that help our students to become so much more. Bernie is the perfect example of that. So I'm very proud to start with this. Bernie is in fact the Associate Dean for Leadership Development and the Clinical Professor of Management at Kellogg. And he's an expert on the subject of leadership and organizational change. But also, you know, he is really leading the effort in the leadership development of our alumni, which at Kellogg is such an integral component of the trip through Kellogg. And as I'm saying, he's had an amazing career. He retired in 2016 from the Army as a Brigadier General. He led for 4 years the West Point Department of Behavioral Science and Leadership. And I was most impressed by the fact that in 2006, the Apache helicopter unit he led in South Korea was the top unit globally in the US Army annual best aviation unit competition. I'm afraid I will never top that in my life. So but I'm glad that we have someone like that in our faculty. And you know, personally, it's been a pleasure to work with Bernie. Wherever I go and I mention him and people have met him, everybody immediately lightens up. So Bernie, welcome. Thank you for coming. And I have a few questions for you. I want to mention to people, I'll come to your question at the end, but actually, if you have questions, feel free to start sending them in and I can wave them in my question if they fit in right in. So can you start taking a bit more about your professional background? As I said, that looks very interesting, and your role at Kellogg, and how did you get to study leadership and organizational change?
Well, Francesca, thank you very much for the warm introduction. I am very honored to be a part of this series and most importantly to be a part of the Kellogg community. And so I'd also like to extend my welcome to all the Kellogg alums who have taken time out of their busy schedules to spend a little time in conversation with one another. When thinking about my background, obviously the thing that first comes to mind for most people is 30 years I spent as a military officer. So I was privileged to serve as a commissioned officer in the United States Army, where I primarily led aviation organizations. Obviously, I was a pilot as well, but the majority of my time was spent actually overseeing organizations of different size and complexity. So those organizations ranged anywhere from 10 people on the low end to over 3,000 people on the high end. So I've had functional operational roles, I've had general management operational roles. They've spanned several industries, if you would, within the military, whether that was serving in airborne operation units or special operation units, or even the military's own higher education apparatus. So I was challenged to exercise leadership personally across a variety of organizations that were doing very different things. In terms of how I became interested in studying leadership, the thing that I started to realize early on in my career was that when looking at the difference between organizations that excelled relative to their peers, for me, the thing that almost always stood out was the quality of leadership being exercised within the organization. Consequently, I decided I want to learn more about this science so that I could then apply that science artfully in my own leadership activities. And that started me on this journey of formal exploration of leadership-related topics and also of change-related topics, because many times I was thrown in the roles where I had to oversee some aspect of significant organizational change. In terms of how I integrate that understanding at Kellogg, the way I always like to lay it out for folks is if you think about every one of our degree programs at Kellogg as a product line, I own none of the products, but I work with all of the products to ensure the aspect of each product that's related to leadership development integrates best-in-class research, and that we deliver that insight in a way that's consistent with Kellogg's core beliefs and culture. And so in some respects, I'm an in-house consultant. In some respects, I'm also an in-house content provider because I help provision workshops, but also teach courses in most of our degree programs. So full-time, evening, weekend, our management of science program, and soon in our executive MBA program. So that's a little bit about where I came from, about how I got interested in the topic, about what I'm currently doing at Kellogg, and why it excites me so much.
That's great. Great that you're excited. But now, exactly, we want to learn some lesson from here. And given that you're coming from the military, right? So when a leader finds him or herself, right now, everybody in the middle of a battle that they hadn't anticipated, because let's be honest, we didn't see this coming, right? What should they do? What should they do?
Several things immediately come to mind. First, mine history. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the past that can inform how we approach things in the present. And so it behooves us to look at the past and say, what have we learned from similar events over time? How can we integrate that into our current activities? The second thing is to understand that while complex, the thing that's going to help you to navigate it is to really leverage all of the people you have at your disposal. So how do you build the right team to address the challenge? Now, sometimes you're only going to have the team that you already had prior to the crisis, but at other times you can assemble a group of people to help you with whatever challenge you're confronting. And then the last thing is to commit yourself to learning in real time, that you have to learn on a daily basis. You can't simply just do things and then not think about how those things unfolded. What are you going to carry forward with you? What lesson did you learn about what not to do the following day? But you have to maintain that learning orientation even in the midst of trying to take very rapid action.
So actually, given that you put it into terms of learning, but daily, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people right now lead organizations and businesses, and the trade-off is, should I focus on today and how do I keep the business alive? Or should I focus on the long term? Or how do I manage the two?
I think that's a wonderful question. The bottom line is you should never do anything short term that's going to negate your long-term vitality. So you always have to keep in mind, are the things we're doing in the short term also aligned with the things we're desirous of pursuing long term? Anything that's going to compromise your long-term vitality, you should not do. So for example, if a business says, in order to get through this, we're going to take on an unsustainable amount of debt. Well, it might get you through today, But that decision, because you hadn't thought about how will it play out later on down the road, can actually compromise the organization's long-term success. We see decisions like that playing out in real time in spaces like retail right now, where organizations had done some things short-term a while back, and they took on unsustainable debt loads, and now they find themselves in these conditions. The market has turned because of that decision a while back to take on so much debt. Now they find themselves completely hamstrung. And so you always have to ask yourself, am I doing short-term things that help facilitate long-term success?
That's very interesting. And so in general, right, are there other lessons from your military service that, you know, it does feel like we're in the middle of a battle or a war, really. So what are the other lessons from your experience?
There are a number of lessons that come to mind right now. One is you have to be optimistic and realistic simultaneously. So you have to have the optimism that, yes, we will get through this, but you have to have the realism and say, we are going to have to encounter a lot of difficulty along the way. If you're just overly optimistic, but you're not realistic, that's going to actually undermine your ability to sustain effort over time. And you have leaders out there right now that are trying to give very optimistic communication messages, but they're downplaying the realistic effort it will take to work through this. And so one of the things you learn in the military, always be optimistic, also be realistic. Additionally, learn how to breathe in the midst of a crisis. So if we go back to something like the Yerkes-Dodson curve, when stress goes up, so does our performance, but too much stress can lead to suboptimal performance. Our performance actually starts to diminish. In a crisis situation, the environment is already providing enough stimulus, and so that curve is going to rise rapidly. Creating needless stress on your organization in that environment can actually start the overall performance to decline. And so when things get tough, leaders have to help others learn how to take a breath, see what's going on around them, make reasoned decisions, and then also learn lessons from them. If something didn't work, figure out why, move on quickly. Don't dwell on the mistake. Remain focused on figuring out the way ahead. So those are just a few of the lessons.
That's very interesting. I need to take notice. Well, actually, it will be recorded this. We can all really watch it and learn. But so how do I distinguish, how do I define leadership versus crisis leadership? Are they two really different things, or how can I compare them?
When thinking about leadership, there's no single definition that has been universally adopted by scholars. And so one way of looking at leadership is looking at it from the lens of three outcomes: that leaders are responsible for creating direction, gaining alignment, and maintaining the commitment of the organizational members. So even in a crisis, those three things remain the same. The three outcomes remain the same. The context in which you're trying to create those three outcomes has become exceptionally challenging. When you take a look at the literature on crisis leadership, once again, there's no single definition that's been universally adopted when we talk about what it means to be a leader in a crisis. But when you look at all of the definitions, usually they talk about having to lead through a sudden or significant negative event. So while the event is sudden, while it is significant, and if left unaddressed properly, can have some very bad consequences associated with it, leaders are still required, even in that context, to establish clear direction, to align their respective organizational efforts, and to maintain people's commitment going through it. So the outcomes don't change, but the context most certainly makes the challenge associated with each of those outcomes more difficult.
That's very interesting. There is a question which was immediate follow-up for your previous question, and was asking, what examples can you share of optimism but lack realism?
Examples I can share of optimism but lack
realism, yes.
without getting political, I'd say leaders around the world who are saying that we will have a vaccine by the end of the year, when scientific experts are telling us that on average, if you are successful, it takes 12 to 18 months. And that's an extraordinarily aggressive timeline. So there's tremendous optimism that we have these brilliant minds around the world working on this. But if we're not realistic, you know, the end of the year is going to come, we're not going to have a vaccine, and people are going to become deflated because they've been told over and over again, our fate will change as soon as the vaccine shows up. Then you don't have a vaccine, so now what does this mean? And you've exhausted them emotionally. And so leaders have to be able to say, yes, we will discover a way to combat this, but it will take time.
That's very interesting. Now, the difficulty these days, and I have to say, I'm in also experience every day, things are shifting so fast, every day, constantly. How can one lead when things are moving so fast?
So in the military, we have a concept called leader's intent. And it lays out several things that are important for organizational members to understand. And while the things going on a daily basis might shift, the overall intent behind the organization's efforts usually does not. And so the first thing you have to lay out is the why. You know, why are we doing what we're doing? So as the reality changed for Northwestern, hey, we're facing a $90 million shortfall for fiscal year 2020. We had to start examining, okay, why must Northwestern relook how it provisions the delivery of goods and services? So always give the purpose. Then you have to lay out the key task. What are those things that we have to do, otherwise success cannot be achieved? There are things that are must do, there are things that are nice to do. Key tasks are must do. We will fail if we do not accomplish these things at a minimum. And so are you clear about that? And then the final thing is a clear definition of success, helping the organization to understand how will we know whether or not we've won. And so that can be outlined in a variety of ways. You know, if we look at our current situation, it might be that we've stopped the spread of COVID-19 and can contain it because of a variety of measures we've put in place. But there should be some other success criteria as well, that we've been able to maintain the university's operations at a sustainable level, so on and so forth. And so daily, things are going to be moving a lot all around you. But the why probably doesn't change. Those key tasks, they stay pretty solid. A new key task might emerge based on something that's interjected itself into the context. But most of the key tasks will remain fairly stable. And then that success criteria, we usually should start with the end in mind when figuring out how are we going to allocate resources over time. And so if people understand intent, as the truth changes for a variety of things, they can make decisions in real time based on, will this decision help to achieve my leader's intent? If so, do it. If not, rethink it.
I see. But when you have all this definition of success, and when you have also so many fires to put out, then how do you prioritize?
So there's a lot of literature that, you know, breaks things down into buckets, if you would. You know, must do, nice to do if you have time, name your thing. So when you go back through those key tasks, you have to prioritize anything that, if left unaddressed, would compromise your ability to accomplish a key task. So prime example, a key task, move to the delivery of classes via a remote platform. If we did not do that successfully, we would have failed as an institution. That's a key task. If you can't deliver classes remotely, then you can't deliver class. If we don't deliver class, then we don't execute on our mission. So we have to prioritize anything that's related to our ability to execute on that key task. Now, there are some other things that are not part of a key task, but that we know are important. And so they should have a lower priority than those things that are directly related to the exercising of a key task. And then you've got other things that are always in the, hey, I'm always looking for ways to just improve the world around me kind of bucket. And so being very clear about your priorities by relating them back to what are those key tasks, what are those things that, you know, are always omnipresent, if you would, and then what are those things that if I have bandwidth that's not completely occupied by the first two, that I can work on just trying to make things better.
Now, another thing that's, you know, is what is the, how do we distinguish, or how do we, it's a fine line between experimenting and taking risks, right? And I'm sure coming from the military, that must be such a thing that you always have in mind, right? But even in the business, when you allocate money, time, people, right? How do we draw the line? When do we move from one to the other, especially unnecessary risks?
Yeah, you know, as a pilot, they teach us that there's a difference between smart risk and dumb risk. Mm-hmm. Smart risk is there's a gap between what you know and what you need to know, but the gap is such that given your experience, given the resource and everything else, you stand a reasonable chance of being able to navigate that gap. That's smart risk. Dumb risk is that gap is really large and you do it anyway. And if you fail, there's no coming back from it. Organizations have to underwrite smart risk. They should never underwrite dumb risk. And when figuring out, you know, how do you make that allocation of resources, once again, if there's a need that exists that if left unaddressed is going to compromise your ability to accomplish the mission, and a gap exists right now in that capability, and you need to close that gap, you have to experiment there. Because if you don't experiment there, once again, that's going to lead to not accomplishing something that needs to happen in order to generate success. So you have to experiment there. We had to experiment with how to use Zoom as our primary platform. And so we started some great experiments like introduction of virtual course moderators. That's an experiment. We didn't know exactly right up front how to do that effectively, but we've learned in real time how to integrate that amazing resource into our daily classes, and it's been a game changer for us. You know, for right now, I'm teaching a class in our MSMS program, and Stacy Nussbaum, who's serving as my virtual course moderator, is indispensable. But Stacy and I have had to figure out, how do I best integrate her into the pedagogy for the course? That's a classic experiment that if we had decided not to integrate that, then we could have delivered a less than stellar remote learning experience. And our students, no matter what's going on in the world, they expect world-class from us. And so we have to undertake those experiments that allow us to deliver a world-class education. But then there's other experiments where, you know, in the moment, they just don't have the same level of priority. We're always undertaking experiments, for example, with our online presence. How do we deliver a more, you know, impactful online experience when people are trying to figure out what is Kellogg all about? Well, right now, that's probably not a priority experiment, but it is an important experiment because we're always trying to figure out how can we enhance our connection to the world. And then there are other things that just, when you take a look at the resource you have, the time available to you, the importance and the potential ROI, you go, now is just not the time to think about doing that. And so you're always having to go back to clarity of priority of effort. The things that help you to accomplish your key task and are indispensable to generating success, if there's a gap in your ability to deliver on any one of those key tasks, then you have to undertake experiments.
That's very interesting. Now, I see a lot of questions coming in, but let me ask one more question and then we'll go back to those. In a way, it's a continuation of that idea between experimenting and taking risk, right? Is also people can, look for opportunities and stretch themselves, but maybe sometimes it's stretching too much, right? So how do you, again, balance that type of, the difference between the two?
There's a concept in leader development called a zone of proximal development. It comes from a researcher by the name of Zavatsky. And Zavatsky asserts that we all have two levels of performance, typical and maximal. Maximal performance is when we know the stakes are high and we're being evaluated, and it's us operating at our very best. Typical performance is what we do on a day-to-day basis. And when looking at that difference between operating our absolute best and how we normally operate, that gap, when it's around 35, 40%, that's a great stretch opportunity. If we give somebody a task or a challenge to address, and that gap is greater than 40, now that's too much risk. We're using hope as a method, and odds are it's not going to turn out well for them. And so even when the gap exists, how do you underwrite the risk? Surround people with great support mechanisms. So understand, here's what you currently know, here's what you're going to have to learn, here's how we account for those gaps in your understanding, here's a resource you can turn to. So prime example, when Kellogg decided that, yes, we need to get on remote delivery right away. Well, some folks had already done it and some folks hadn't, but no matter what, we're like, you will deliver your class remotely. So what did we do? We queried the faculty and said, who are our rock stars at doing this? And we had them write up white papers on here are best practices. Here are the right kind of resources, like the headset I'm wearing. You know, Mike Mazio sent me a note saying, here's what we know are the best resources or individuals teaching in a remote setting. And he made it easy. And so now we started utilizing internal resources to help backstop those of us who had never had the opportunity to deliver classes via a remote platform. So each one of us had to go into that stretch assignment, but we were supported by others that had more experience, and we could leverage their insights to help us prepare for that challenge. Because we couldn't say that simply because someone hadn't done it before, that we weren't going to put the onus on them to deliver their class remotely this quarter. We had to do it. That was a stretch opportunity for every member of the faculty, but we backstopped every member of the faculty with the expertise of others who had done it in the past.
Thank you so much for these examples, because I'm actually so proud of the Kellogg faculty who in no time delivered such a world-class, courses. And as you said, it was like by innovating, experimenting with the VCM and helping each other. So thank you for these examples. Now, I'm reserving for myself one more question at the end, but there are so many questions here. I want to ask you a couple, like, how can leaders be transparent with what they're thinking in terms of layoff cuts, with the current uncertainty about how people will survive? So, there's tough choices. Can you be transparent about that?
So the answer is yes, and what transparency means varies. So you can be transparent that conversations are transpiring related to these tough topics, but it doesn't mean that individuals can be offered insight into all of the conversations themselves. So we want to be transparent that yes, we are looking at a variety of tough choices we might have to make, and we can be transparent about who's involved in those conversations. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to give you a transcript every time you're having a conversation with Morty Shapiro or the provost or anybody else. And so sometimes people have come to believe that transparency means I should have 100% access to all of the information. And that's not what transparency was ever meant to convey. It was meant to convey that organizational members should always have an awareness of what is transpiring within the organization. So leaders should always strive for effective communications. They should always strive to keep people informed, but they also have an obligation, because of the complexity of many issues, to retain certain information at certain levels until actual decisions are made.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I see another one. How has your experience in the Army influenced the way you deliver and receive feedbacks?
That is a great question. Yeah. One of the things that was interesting when I came to Kellogg, and I love Kellogg. I bleed purple. I think it's an amazing organization. I'm very proud to call myself a Kellogg alum. Was that the level of directness that was employed in the military was not the same that I experienced when I arrived at Kellogg. And so in the military, you're taught to deliver feedback in real time. You're taught to make it behavioral in its orientation. You're taught to deconstruct issues and never to vilify people. And so moving into an environment that's so rooted in collegiality and is very focused on ensuring we display great empathy and that we do it in a way that reflects all the cultural nuance that's associated with being part of a global enterprise. That using the same methodology that I employ in the military when trying to deliver feedback to, people in this setting, while my intentions might be great, it might not be received the same way. So the level of directness, the level of willingness to confront something in the moment was something I had to learn how to do differently at Kellogg. Still have that obligation to deliver feedback, but had to think far more intently about timing, about taking into account where's this person from, what informs their thinking, where are they at in their developmental journey, even the relationship between faculty member and student. That's a very different thing than manager and employee. A student does not work for you. And so while you might want to provision some feedback and service of helping to foster their development, you have to think about it in a very different way. And so a lot of what I took from the military most certainly is still applicable at Kellogg, but there are contextual differences that required me to learn how to modify my behavior in order to be effective at Kellogg.
Oh, that's very thoughtful. I haven't so many. How does a leader balance the desire to build or obtain consensus versus insert a situation when in his her best judgment, a specific direction must be taken even without first getting that consensus?
It really comes down to know where the line is. If in trying to build consensus, you're going past that line where you can make an effective decision, then consensus is not what you should strive for. When put into a position of authority, it's always incumbent upon you to get as much buy-in as you can, but also to make timely and effective decisions. And so there's always this line where hey, we can talk about it up to here, but at this point, we've got to act. If you go beyond that because you're so concerned with trying to still get that buy-in, that now you've marginalized your ability to make an effective decision, then you've abdicated on your responsibility as a leader.
And actually, there's a question that looks a bit like a follow-up. How do you deal with people who are publicly opposing the change management you're trying to achieve? So it's clear people who are trying to deal with all these things.
Absolutely. So there's a great story from Alan Mulally, who was the former CEO of Ford. And when Alan went into Ford, the company was losing a ton of money. And so Alan implemented a new performance management system. And he would meet weekly with the leaders of the enterprise globally, where they'd brief certain aspects of their business. Every week, same brief. Now, this is a company that's losing almost double-digit billions. But yet, every week when he went into that initial series of briefings, everyone briefed they were green for their status. And so Alan quickly started to discern there were some folks that were just completely resistant to the change he was trying to implement at Ford. And he would go up to him and say, it's okay if you don't want to do this, but we're going to do it and we'd like you to be a part of it. But if you don't want to do this, then we should be having a conversation about where you'll be headed in the future. And so resistance is actually a gift because it helps you to understand what matters to people. And so once you find out why they're resistant, then you can start to use that to say, what will it take to convert you to our cause? But if at some point you decide, it does not appear that you're committed to being part of our cause, given the manner in which we're going to pursue it, then you have to have the willingness to say, that's okay, but it's probably not going to work out for you here. So I'm not advocating that everybody just step in line and not express their opinion, but they have to be able to show how what they're saying is in service of fostering the desired outcome. And they also have to have the ability to show how what they're advocating will result in more benefits than the current course of action that's being advocated. Because if they're just saying, I don't want to do that, but they can't show that here's another way that will result in even better benefits, then the fact that they just have another way is insufficient.
I understand. That's very. Now, so how would you differentiate between leaders and managers in day-to-day dealing? What is the difference in how leaders think of success as compared to managers? I'm sure coming from the military and coming into a business school, right? You must have.
Well, yeah, I think this is one of the areas that was really honed by study. So if we go back to Abraham Zeleznik's classic 1977 Harvard Business Review article, Leaders and Managers, there's been a lot that's still taken from that article to this very day, that you manage things, you lead people, that managers strive to make process efficient. Leaders strive to make organizations relevant. And they're two sides of the same coin. An organization can exist for a certain period of time with nothing more than competent leadership or competent management, excuse me. They can keep refining their process, they can keep generating value, but when the context changes and the processes they are enacting are no longer generating value, simply working harder at those is going to accelerate your demise. That's where the leadership side of the coin comes in, because the leadership says, what experiments do we need to be undertaking in order to find a space where we can continue to generate value? So you need leaders to underwrite risk. It's been said that managers seek to eliminate waste in an organization and leaders seek to inject it, because leaders are provisioning those experiments that can lead to new insights. And so you want both, because you can't have an organization that lacks discipline. You need good managerial process. You've got to watch cost. You've got to think about how are we optimizing the processes that allow us to do what we do. But you also have to have leaders that say, what bets are we going to make? What risk are we going to underwrite? What people are we going to invest in? And so you have to ask yourself, when you put somebody somewhere, what do you need more of? Do you need more of that leader or do you need more of the manager? Sometimes the role is going to demand you be exceptionally good at both. If I think about your role, Francesca, when you think about a dean, you're primarily concerned with leader, because there are other managers that report to the dean that can help optimize process throughout the institution. But that dean's the one who's helping to set vision, thinking about what big bets will the institution make, trying to get stakeholders to buy into that vision and contribute to it through development efforts. Leadership is the cornerstone of a great B school dean. But there's a level right below that where we need really good managers to help us drive efficiency, to make sure we're doing things in a way that allows us to best utilize scarce resources. And so it's not to say one's better than the other. They're just different and they're complementary. You need both. But sometimes you need one more than the other. What we're in right now requires leadership more than management. But once we get through this, we'll probably be in a situation where we require more management than we do leadership.
That's very interesting. And actually, there's also another interesting question about So at the time of crisis, would you go more with training and trusting staff to act towards an understood goal, or because it's crisis, you want more like a top-down directive?
That's an interesting one, because you have to look at the amount of risk associated with anything that you empower somebody to do. So is the risk such that when you empower somebody, that if they don't accomplish their task, you can absorb the setback? Because if you can't, then you probably need to have a little more control over their activities. Whereas there are some activities that, yes, if this doesn't go well, it'll be a setback, but we can survive that. And so the answer is it depends, because it's always a function of who you're dealing with and what resources have you provided that party, because resources are a way of addressing risk, but people are the ones who actually assess risk, accept risk, and have to work their way through the risk. And so it's always this understanding of who's on my team, what am I giving each of my team members to work with. Some places I'm going to be more intimately involved, in others I can accept more risk because I've got a really strong player there and I know I've given them what they need in order to succeed.
Okay, they are all related, these questions, so interesting. Another one is, actually there's one that is very related to the question just before, and is asking, can you be a leader in one role of the organization and the manager in another role?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, prime example, say you grew up in operations. And so when an issue arises in the operations function of the organization and people are struggling with it, but you have so much experience in that you can go in, quickly assess what needs to transpire, help get people back in alignment, and then step back out. That's acting as a great manager. I know what right looks like. I know that this isn't it. I'm not going to do your job for you, but I can help you understand what you need to account for. I step in, I help manage the situation, and then I step back, monitor it, but allow those managers to do what they need to do. In a different area, I might look at it and say, hey, you're not thinking expansively enough. You really need to challenge the existing paradigm. You're caught in your own previous success and you're not thinking critically about what's necessary for us to be successful going forward. And so in that part of the business, you're going to have to go in and start demonstrating some leadership behaviors to challenge the status quo and to get people to break out of their comfort zone. And so what you do always depends on where you're at. Now, ideally, they'd say, you know, everywhere I go, all I do is lead. Well, that might very well be true. But there are times when you're doing things that are more related to the management function, and there are times when you're doing things that are more related to the exercising of leadership.
And how can leaders balance their emotions on today's issues and relating to your team while maintaining the level-headedness a leader needs?
So if we go look at the work of Bill George out of Harvard Business School, he was a longtime CEO of Medtronic, and he wrote the book True North. George's work and the work of many other leadership scholars talks about the importance of having a strong support network. Also, the importance of engaging in routine introspection. And so one of the ways in which you can maintain an even keel, that consistency, is to ensure that you're leveraging that support network so that they're giving you insight, they're also helping you to recharge your batteries. And so in the midst of everything that's going on, this is why it's so important for people to maintain relationships that matter, because those relationships help recharge their battery, help them gain perspective, help them maintain that even keel. And so if all you're doing is working and you're not reaching out to those folks who help you to see yourself in an objective way, if you're not investing in your own well-being, then it's going to bleed over to those you're engaging on a daily basis. And so what I've found is that as this crisis has continued to unfold, people who really understand that are making the time to invest in their support networks, because those support networks are also an investment in that leader's ability to be there for their people. I gave the example to Francesca that last night I was on a Zoom call with my IMBA class from Kellogg, and many of us had not spoken in a while. But what was supposed to be a 1-hour session turned into 3 hours as we were batting ideas off of one another about how we're contending with the challenges that are transpiring in our respective industries. You had people in financial services on the call. You had people in secondary and preschool education on the call. You had people in insurance on the call. And the thing that allowed us to engage one another in such an authentic way was that we had this deep and abiding connection that had been established over the course of our 2 years in the IMBA program and nurtured over time. And every member of my study group from when I was in IMBA was on the call. And so our ability to be honest with one another, go, hey, how are you doing? What are you contending with? What do you think is the opportunity available to you right now? Was hugely beneficial. My wife came up and she's like, I thought you're only supposed to be on the call for an hour. Why are you still on there? I'm like, because this is valuable. This is valuable time. And I came out of it feeling so good that energy most certainly carried over into today's activities and will probably stay with me for a protracted period of time, because that expenditure of 180 minutes is going to produce long-term resolve over the next couple of weeks because of the things we shared in that forum. And so that's just some of the things. You really have to have a strong support network, and you really have to bake introspection into your daily activities.
That's very interesting. Because you were also, this was a virtual meeting, there is a question here who says, you exemplify the value benefits from having human interaction. And yet today we can't physically interact, and we will have to be accustomed to working with groups remotely. How are you thinking about this today?
So one of the things that I try to remind folks is that even in the midst of what's transpiring, there are ways in which you can generally connect with one another. So I'm on the board of a CBD company, and I had a call today with the CEO and founder. And the team is grinding. I mean, there's a lot going on right now. People are just working their butts off. And one of the questions I posed to them was, how are you letting people understand that what they do is valued? It's not just a job they have to do, but the manner in which they're going about trying to make the company successful. How are you honoring that? And he goes, I don't know. And I said, technique. I want you to put on your calendar right now, pick 5 people in the organization. I want you to send them a handwritten note, and it has to be personal to them. Highlight one thing they've done that you noticed, tie it back to why it matters to the organization, how it's consistent with the organization's values, and how you sincerely appreciate what they're doing. Now that is an act where you don't have to physically be present, but it creates a physical connection. And so a lot of folks are lamenting what they don't have, and they're not embracing what they do have. You still have the power to do a whole range of things that will create sparks in people's lives. Don't worry about what you don't have. Think about how can you maximize what you do. That's what the great organizations are going to do. That's what the great leaders are going to do.
That is so inspiring, Bernie. And there are so many questions coming because clearly people are inspired by what you're talking. I see one here, which is interesting for me because you've been in military business school. What is your experience leading people of different generations?
That's all you do in the military. You go into it. You go into an organization. You're a frontline manager. You're straight out of college, and you will have individuals in the organization ranging anywhere from their high teens to late 50s. And so I've lived that reality throughout my entire career. And what I find is that we're fond of highlighting how many differences exist between the generations, but going back to the last thing, we don't acknowledge how much overlap exists between the generations as well. People want to be appreciated. People want to be supported. People want to be acknowledged. People want to communicate in an effective way. People want to know that you are a champion for them. And so what I found is that, yes, there are differences in terms of what one generation might be more inclined to experience than another. But if you start with the points of commonality and build out from that, you're going to be much better off than starting with the points of difference and then saying, let's try to focus on that. I'm still somebody who will pick up the phone and call somebody. I know that if I want to get a hold of my kids, the best way to get a hold of them is to send them a text. But once I send them a text, and then I might say, please call me, I need to speak with you. And so I'm doing something that honors how they communicate as their primary form, but I'm also still honoring something that I believe is very important, to actually hear your voice. So, yes, generational differences do exist. I think there's danger in characterizing somebody by their age and not by their actual personal construct. I've met individuals that are millennials or the absolute antithesis of everything that's said about a millennial. And I've met boomers that are the same way. Start with commonality, figure out how can we make this an enduring positive relationship focused on creating win-win scenarios, and you're probably going to be better off. That's what I've found in working across generations. People want to be successful. People want to be in a genuine relationship.
Yes, that's true. What have you seen as the most effective ways of measuring one's own leadership effectiveness?
For me, it's quite simple. How does the organization perform in your absence? And what do the people in the organization go on to do professionally that they trace back to the time they spent with you? So I think of it kind of from a legacy perspective. Obviously, you can look at those KPIs that are developed regarding any aspect of your organization. How are we doing in terms of top line and bottom line? How are we doing in terms of margin? That's all stuff. And a lot of that stuff, quite frankly, is related to management type activities. But how many people in your organization were able to move up in the organization because of the investments you made in them? How was the organization able to perform in a period of tremendous stress? How has the organization developed over time culturally? And is that culture one that's attractive? So there's a lot of different ways in which you can measure your overall leadership effectiveness. But for me, two of the things I always look at: when I'm not involved, how do people perform? And when they leave, what kind of opportunities did we help generate for them?
That's very interesting. Now, I had kept one question for mine as last, but before, I really need to ask you one, which I saw here, which said, General Banks, when will the Army consistently beat the Navy at football?
There is an agitator on the line. As somebody who played football at West Point, I'm very, very passionate about that rivalry. And yes, last year we lost to Navy. We beat Navy to 3 years prior to that, and it is a storied rivalry. I can tell you this, that there's not a day that goes by that I don't want to beat them with every fiber of my being, but there's also not a day that goes by that I don't respect them with every fiber of my being. It is an amazing rivalry. Whoever said that clearly is probably deluded in their thinking. And all that being said, I still wish them all the best.
Let me conclude with one question. It's an interesting military leadership crisis. It's been in the newspaper recently, and it's related to the COVID. And wonder whether you can comment on that, about the story about Navy Captain Brad Crozier, who was fired for sounding the alarm about the spread of COVID-19 on his aircraft carrier, and the superior made a decision, then resigned a week later, and Crozier was recommended for reinstatement before being reassigned to other duties. This is not what we usually observe, right, in the military. What went wrong there?
So one of the things I've learned is that unless you are present or have access to all the information, that trying to opine is very fraught with peril. And so I don't have access to all the information regarding that. What I can say is, as a leader in the military, you are taught that your first obligation is to always accomplish the mission while at the same time taking care of your organizational members. And so I most certainly believe that Captain Crozier was trying to act from a very principled place. He was not trying to be a malcontent or just somebody who didn't care about following convention. I believe he was most certainly trying to act from a principled place. There are some things to understand about the military culture that are a little different than what you see in many companies. One, this notion of chain of command, the sanctity of that. One of the interesting things that's transpired in the aftermath is that his immediate boss was on the same ship he was on. So the person he reported to was on the ship. That person was also on the email with the 10 other parties. But you haven't heard a single thing from his immediate superior. And so it begs the question, what was transpiring in terms of honoring the chain of command? That's number one. You've heard nothing from that person. Think about it, if this was Goldman Sachs and somebody who's running a business unit in Goldman Sachs, it's in the same building, same floor, office was next door to their immediate boss, and something blows up and you don't hear anything from their immediate boss. You just hear it straight from the CEO of the firm. That's kind of how this whole thing's played out in the media. You know, the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Defense, who are several levels above where Captain Crozier resides in the organization, are the ones engaged in media relations related to the event. But his immediate superior, you've heard nothing from. So you want to know what was going on in terms of the interactions within the chain of command. That's number one. Number two, that when the Secretary of the Navy flew out to the aircraft carrier and started to denigrate the captain for his willingness to fight on behalf of the organizational members, that was a massive misstep that ultimately cost him his job. Instead of going out there and trying to help them to understand the why behind the decision, he started to give the why, but the how was completely flawed. He started poor-mouthing the captain, basically asserting that the organizational members' trust in the captain was misplaced. And he had tremendous trust amongst his organizational members. And so you saw a series of communications missteps that transpired, which highlights why in a crisis situation, one of the most important things that every leader has to contend with, effective communications. Learning how to communicate in a precise way and to craft a cogent narrative, to be transparent, but at the same time, understand that there are sensitivities at play is essential. And the acting Secretary of the Navy completely botched that aspect of crisis leadership. So I don't know all the facts. I do know that those aspects did transpire. You know, there was clearly something was going on with the relationship between Captain Crozier and his immediate boss. There was clearly some communications missteps. And in the aftermath, there's been a desire to kind of see how we can get things back on azimuth. You know, the last thing I'd say is in any crisis, there's always 3 phases according to the literature. Pre-crisis, how do you prepare for something like this? Crisis response, what do you do in the moment? And then post-crisis, how do you take the lessons learned and implement them to make things better? Crisis response, as it pertains to that incident, is still going on. They're still trying to figure out if they're going to let him back into his job. But the bigger question is, what's going to be the post-crisis actions for the Navy as a result of what transpired? Because if they just view it as a statistical outlier or one-off, something like this could very well happen again in the future, and that would be exceptionally unfortunate.
Well, Bernie, this was an exceptional start of our series. It's been amazing. I am so sorry I couldn't read all the questions because they coming in all furiously, really inspired by your point. At the same point, someone just sent the text saying, I miss being a Kellogg student, and that's how we all feel. You just exemplify exactly, that's why Kellogg is so amazing, because we get such important lessons. But still, even as a Kellogg alumni, we can listen to someone like you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody to listening. And, you know, we have another great series coming in the next time, but thank you, Bernie. This has been amazing.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay optimistic, stay realistic.
Thank you. Bye-bye.